January 17th, 1945. Somewhere in the frozen hills of eastern Belgium, the snow falls in thick, silent curtains across the Ardennes forest. A young German soldier, barely 22, his Wehrmacht uniform tattered and stained with mud and blood, crouches behind the skeletal remains of a burned-out Panzer IV. His breath comes in ragged clouds. The rifle in his hands trembles, not from the cold alone, but from exhaustion that has carved itself into his very bones. For 6 weeks, he and his unit have been pushing westward in what the High Command called the Führer's final masterstroke, the great counteroffensive that would split the Allied armies and turn the tide of war. But now, in this frozen wasteland where the trees stand like charred sentinels and the ground is littered with the debris of shattered dreams, he knows the truth that his commanders refuse to speak. The offensive has failed. The Reich is dying, and he is more afraid of returning to his own lines than he is of the American soldiers advancing through the white silence ahead. His hands, blackened with frostbite, fumble with an empty ammunition pouch. There are no more bullets. There has been no food for 3 days, only snow melted in a dented canteen and the faint memory of bread. Somewhere in the distance he hears the rumble of engines, American tanks, American trucks, the mechanical symphony of an enemy that seems to possess infinite resources, infinite strength. He closes his eyes.
When he opens them again, 3 figures in olive drab emerge from the tree line, their rifles raised, but their faces surprisingly calm. One of them shouts something in English. The German soldier does not understand the words, but he understands the gesture. He raises his hands above his head and steps out from behind the wreckage. His war is over. What he does not yet know, what he cannot possibly comprehend in this moment of surrender, is that he is about to enter a world so utterly different from everything he has been taught, so incomprehensibly abundant, that it will shatter the very foundations of the ideology he has carried since boyhood. This is not a story about military defeat. It is a story about ideological collapse. It is the story of how hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, indoctrinated since childhood in the mythology of Aryan superiority and the decadence of Western democracy, came to call American prisoner of war camps das beste Ort auf Erden, the best place on earth. It is a story about the quiet, devastating power of abundance in a world starved by totalitarianism. And it begins not with grand speeches or dramatic battles, but with something as simple and profound as a cup of coffee and a piece of white bread.
The ideological foundation had been laid long before the first shot was fired. In the decade leading up to 1939, German youth had been systematically molded by the machinery of National Socialist education. Boys who would become the soldiers of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS had spent their formative years in the Hitler Youth, where they were taught that Germany was a nation besieged by inferior races and degenerate democracies. America, they learned, was a mongrel nation, weakened by racial mixing and Jewish influence, a paper tiger whose industrial might was built on the exploitation of others and would crumble when confronted by the disciplined power of German will. They were shown carefully edited films of breadlines during the Depression, of strikes and unrest, of what Nazi propagandists called the Jewish Bolshevik chaos of American capitalism. They were told that American soldiers were soft, spoiled by materialism, incapable of the sacrifice required for true greatness. The German soldier, by contrast, was portrayed as the apex of human evolution, strong, disciplined, prepared to endure any hardship for the glory of the fatherland. This ideology was not mere propaganda, it was a worldview, a total system of belief that shaped every aspect of consciousness. When young Germans marched into Poland in September 1939, when they swept across France in the spring of 1940, when they drove deep into the Soviet Union in 1941, they carried with them an unshakable conviction in their own superiority. The early victories seemed to confirm everything they had been taught: the speed of the blitzkrieg, the collapse of seemingly powerful enemies, the ease with which German armies conquered nations. All of it appeared to validate the Nazi promise that will and racial purity could overcome any obstacle.
But by 1944, that certainty had begun to fracture. The Eastern Front had become a meat grinder, consuming entire divisions. The cities of the Reich were burning under Allied bombs. And in the West, following the Normandy invasion, German soldiers encountered for the first time an enemy whose material abundance seemed to mock everything they had been promised about American weakness. The Americans arrived not in penny packets, but in an endless flood of men and machines. Their artillery never seemed to run out of shells. Their planes blackened the sky. Their tanks, though individually inferior to German Panthers and Tigers, came in such overwhelming numbers that it didn't matter. And behind the front lines, German soldiers caught glimpses of an American logistics system so vast, so incomprehensibly wasteful by German standards, that it seemed to belong to another world entirely. The surrender, when it came, was often accompanied by terror. German soldiers had been told stories about what happened to prisoners taken by the Americans and British. Some of these stories were rooted in genuine anxiety about reprisals for German war crimes. Others were pure fabrication, designed by the Nazi leadership to keep soldiers fighting even when the war was clearly lost. They were told that prisoners would be handed over to the Soviets, or that American soldiers, particularly black American soldiers, would torture and execute captured Germans. Some Wehrmacht units received explicit orders that surrender meant death at the hands of the Allies, and that it was better to die fighting than to fall into enemy hands.
So, when our young soldier from the Ardennes forest found himself standing with his hands raised, surrounded by American infantrymen, he expected the worst. Perhaps a beating, perhaps a bullet. At minimum, he expected to be stripped of his belongings, to be treated with the contempt that prisoners in the German system routinely faced. Instead, something utterly unexpected happened. One of the American soldiers, a corporal from Ohio, with a face that seemed too young for the uniform he wore, reached into his jacket and pulled out a pack of Camel cigarettes. He offered one to the German prisoner. When the German, too shocked to respond, simply stared, the American placed the cigarette in the prisoner's mouth and lit it for him. Another soldier produced a canteen and gestured for the German to drink. The water was clean, cold, tasting of metal and something else he couldn't identify, a chemical purity that German soldiers had not experienced in months. This small act of humanity, repeated thousands of times across the battlefields of France and Germany in 1944 and 1945, was the first crack in the ideological edifice. The enemy was supposed to be cruel, vindictive, morally inferior. Yet here they were, sharing cigarettes and water with men who hours before had been trying to kill them. For many German prisoners, this initial encounter produced a cognitive dissonance so severe that they assumed it must be a trick, a temporary kindness that would evaporate once they were away from the front lines. They believed that the real horrors awaited them in the camps.
They could not have been more wrong. The first meal in American captivity often became a story that German POWs would tell for the rest of their lives. After initial processing, a surprisingly bureaucratic affair involving paperwork, medical checks, and the confiscation of weapons and Nazi insignia, prisoners were led to mess techs where they confronted their first genuine American meal. For soldiers who had subsisted for months on black bread, ersatz coffee made from acorns, and increasingly meager rations of cheese and sausage, what they saw seemed like a hallucination born of starvation. White bread, not the dense, dark rye bread mixed with sawdust that had become standard in Germany, but soft, pillowy white bread made from pure wheat flour. Butter, real butter, not the synthetic fat substitute that German civilians had learned to tolerate. Coffee, genuine coffee, dark and strong and served with real sugar and condensed milk. And meat, portions of meat that seemed to Germanize obscenely large. Beef stew, pork chops, chicken, proteins that had become distant memories in the Reich, where meat rations had been cut again and again until even party officials struggled to obtain decent portions.
A former Panzer Grenadier named Klaus Müller, captured near St. Lo in July 1944, later wrote in his private diary, "I thought they had made a mistake. I thought this food was meant for their own soldiers and that we had been brought to the wrong tent. I took a piece of the white bread and held it in my hands, feeling the softness of it, smelling it. I had not seen such bread since before the war, perhaps not since I was a small child. When I bit into it, I began to cry. I was 24 years old, of 3 years of war, and I wept like an infant over a piece of bread." This was not anomalous. American military policy regarding the treatment of prisoners of war was rooted in both practical considerations and genuine ideological commitment to the Geneva Convention. Practically, well-fed prisoners were healthier, less likely to cause problems, and potentially valuable sources of intelligence. But beyond pragmatism, there was a genuine American belief, perhaps naive, certainly idealistic, that treating prisoners with decency demonstrated the moral superiority of democratic values. The United States, with its vast agricultural and industrial capacity, could afford to feed prisoners the same rations provided to American soldiers, and so they did.
The camps themselves defied every expectation. German prisoners arriving at facilities like Camp Como in Mississippi, Camp Hearn in Texas, or Fort Lewis in Washington expected barbed wire and brutality. What they found instead were compounds that, while certainly prison camps with guards and restrictions, bore almost no resemblance to the concentration camps and POW facilities operated by the Reich. The barracks were wooden structures with real beds, mattresses, and blankets. There was running water and functional toilets. There were infirmaries staffed with medical personnel who treated German prisoners with the same care afforded to American soldiers. There were recreation yards where prisoners could play soccer, libraries stocked with books, and even theaters where POWs staged their own productions. Many camps implemented a work program that allowed prisoners to volunteer for agricultural labor, particularly in the American South and Midwest where farm labor was scarce due to the war. German POWs picked cotton, harvested wheat, worked in lumber mills and food processing plants. They were paid a small wage, 80 cents per day, credited to their accounts, which they could use to purchase additional items at the camp canteen. The canteen itself became another source of profound disorientation. German prisoners could buy Coca-Cola, chocolate bars, cigarettes, toiletries, and luxuries that had vanished from German stores years earlier. A former Luftwaffe officer captured in 1943 recalled, "I bought a Hershey bar with my first wages. I had heard of American chocolate but never tasted it. It was sweet almost to the point of pain, rich beyond anything we had in Germany even before the war. I ate it slowly, trying to make it last, and I thought, if this is what their prisoners can buy, what must their own people have?"
The abundance was not limited to food. German POWs noticed that American guards wore uniforms that were well made and standardized, that they had multiple pairs of boots, that their equipment was maintained and replaced regularly. They saw American trucks that ran smoothly because they had adequate fuel and spare parts. They witnessed American efficiency not as the product of harsh discipline or ideological fervor, but as the natural output of a system that could simply afford to do things properly. One German corporal wrote home in a letter that was intercepted and copied by American intelligence, "The Americans waste more than we produce. I saw a soldier throw away a half-eaten tin of meat because he didn't like the taste. In our unit, we would have fought over such a thing. And yet they are winning the war, and we are losing. I no longer understand what we were taught." The transformation of consciousness did not happen overnight.
Many prisoners, particularly the committed Nazis among them, clung desperately to their ideology, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. They insisted that American abundance was temporary, built on stolen wealth, destined to collapse. They claimed that the Germans being treated well were being deceived, that the real America was the one shown in Goebbels' propaganda films. They organized secret Nazi cells within the camps, intimidating other prisoners who expressed doubts about the regime, sometimes even killing suspected traitors. In several camps, notably at Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, American authorities had to segregate hardline Nazis from prisoners who had become anti-Nazi, creating separate compounds to prevent violence. But for the majority of German prisoners, especially those who spent years in American captivity, the daily reality of camp life slowly eroded ideological certainty. They received mail from home describing the collapse of German cities, the hunger, the chaos. They read German-language newspapers published in the camps that, while censored, provided information about the war that contradicted official Nazi narratives. Some camps even showed uncensored documentary footage from the liberation of concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Many German prisoners refused to believe these films were real, insisting they were Allied propaganda. But some believed, and those who believed faced a psychological crisis that words could barely contain. A theology student turned Wehrmacht lieutenant named Johann Schmidt, held at Camp Rustin in Louisiana, experienced what he later described as the death of his soul and its rebirth. After viewing footage from Buchenwald, he refused to eat for 6 days. Other prisoners thought he had gone mad. He sat in the corner of the barracks, staring at nothing, occasionally trembling. When he finally spoke, he said, "I fought for this. I believed in this. Everything I was taught, everything I thought was noble and true, it was built on this, on mountains of corpses. We are not the Herrenvolk. We are murderers. And these people," he gestured toward the American guards, "these soft, undisciplined Americans we were taught to despise, they are the civilized ones. We are the barbarians."
Not every prisoner underwent such dramatic conversion, but the accumulation of small revelations, the well-fed bodies, the clean water, the medical care, the simple decency of guards who saw prisoners as human beings rather than ideological abstractions, created a gradual shift. German POWs began to compare their treatment with what they knew of Soviet prisoners in German camps, starved and worked to death by the millions. They began to question why, if Americans were the decadent weaklings described by Nazi propaganda, they were winning the war so decisively. They began to recognize that the abundance they experienced was not an aberration, but a reflection of a system, democratic capitalism, that generated wealth not through conquest and slavery, but through productivity and voluntary cooperation. The symbolic power of a single object crystallized these transformations. For many German prisoners, that object was coffee. Real American coffee became the tangible representation of everything they had misunderstood about their enemy. In Germany, coffee had become a luxury reserved for the elite, replaced for ordinary citizens by ersatz substitutes made from roasted grains and chicory. The degradation of coffee, like the degradation of bread and meat, symbolized the impoverishment of German life under total war. Nazi ideology claimed that such sacrifices demonstrated German spiritual superiority, that material comfort was a weakness that made democracy soft. Yet here, in American POW camps, even prisoners, enemies, men who had fought against America, received real coffee daily. Not weak coffee, not rationed coffee, but strong coffee, served in quantities that seemed wasteful. German prisoners began their mornings with American coffee. They drank it during breaks from work. They could purchase additional coffee at the canteen. The sheer abundance of this one commodity, multiplied by thousands of commodities, revealed a truth that Nazi ideology could not explain. America was not weak because of its abundance was its strength.
A baker from Hamburg named Friedrich Neumann, captured in France in 1944 and held at Camp Concordia in Kansas, later wrote, "Every morning when I drank that coffee, I thought about my wife and children back home, drinking roasted barley water and calling it coffee. I thought about the ration cards, the queues, the empty shops, and I thought, we were told that sacrifice made us strong, that hardship built character, that comfort was decadence. But the Americans, who sacrifice nothing, who live in comfort, who waste resources we would kill for, they crossed an ocean and defeated us. What does that say about everything we believed? The coffee, like the white bread, like the chocolate bars and the Coca-Cola and the well-made boots, was a silent argument more persuasive than any propaganda. It demonstrated that the ideological foundation of Nazism, that strength came from suffering, that racial purity mattered more than material prosperity, that democracy was weak and decadent, was simply false. The Americans had proved through victory that a free, diverse, materialistic society could outproduce, outfight, and outlast a totalitarian state organized around hierarchy and sacrifice. By the time of their repatriation, many German POWs had been fundamentally changed. The process of return began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. German prisoners boarded ships that would take them back across the Atlantic to a homeland that had been utterly destroyed. They carried with them sea bags containing items purchased at camp canteens, cigarettes, chocolate, canned goods, luxuries that would make them wealthy by the standards of post-war Germany. Many also carried something less tangible but more significant, a revised understanding of the world and their place in it.
The contrast between America and the Germany they returned to was almost too extreme to process. Cities lay in ruins, landscapes of rubble where women and old men picked through debris searching for anything usable. Food was scarce to the point of starvation. The black market ruled the economy. Millions of refugees fled westward from Soviet-occupied territories. The proud Reich of their youth had become a wasteland of defeat,
occupied by foreign armies, divided and humiliated. Many returning POWs found themselves in a strange position. In a society traumatized by defeat and struggling to survive, they were among the lucky ones. They had spent the final year or two of the war safe, well-fed, and relatively comfortable in American camps, while their countrymen had suffered bombing, invasion, and starvation. Some concealed their experiences, sensing that other Germans did not want to hear about how well they had been treated by the enemy. Others spoke openly and became advocates for democracy and reconciliation. A significant number of former POWs became leaders in post-war West Germany, bringing with them memories of American decency that influenced their commitment to rebuilding Germany as a democratic nation integrated with the West. Klaus Müller, the young Panzer Grenadier who had wept over white bread, returned to his village in Bavaria to find his family home destroyed and his father dead from starvation in the final months of the war. He used his savings from camp labor to purchase black market food for his mother and sisters. In 1948, he opened a small bakery using techniques he had learned from an American baker while working in a prison camp kitchen. In 1952, he immigrated to the United States, settling in Milwaukee, where he ran a successful bakery until his retirement. In interviews late in his life, he always returned to the same theme. "I hated Americans. I was taught to hate them, and when I fought against them, that hate felt real and justified. But they defeated my hate, not with more hate, but with bread. They showed me that the world I believed in was a lie, and in showing me that lie, they gave me truth. The camp saved my life, yes, but more than that, it saved my soul."
The story of German POWs in American camps reveals an uncomfortable truth about power. Military might alone does not win hearts and minds. Ideology, no matter how fervently believed, cannot withstand the sustained evidence of lived experience. The Nazi regime told German soldiers that they were members of a master race, destined to rule over inferior peoples, strengthened by sacrifice and hardship, fighting against a decadent and weak democracy. Every one of those claims was tested and refuted by the experience of captivity in America. The Americans did not convert German prisoners through re-education programs or forced confessions, though some such programs existed. They converted them through abundance, through decency, through the simple demonstration that a free society could outproduce and outlast a totalitarian one without sacrificing its fundamental values. The white bread, the coffee, the medical care, the running water, the pay for labor, the libraries and soccer fields, all of it was propaganda more powerful than any film or speech because it was real, tangible, and repeated daily over months and years. This created a curious historical irony. Nazi Germany built a system based on the belief that material comfort weakened people, that hardship built strength, that sacrifice for the state was the highest virtue. The United States, often criticized for its materialism and individualism, demonstrated that material abundance and individual freedom could coexist with military effectiveness and moral purpose. German prisoners, expecting to find weakness and chaos, instead found order built on plenty rather than scarcity, discipline built on consent rather than terror. The camps became, in essence, accidental embassies for democratic capitalism. They were places where totalitarianism came face to face with liberalism, where scarcity met abundance, where ideology confronted reality. The outcome of that confrontation was never really in doubt. Human beings, when given the choice, prefer comfort to sacrifice, plenty to scarcity, freedom to subordination. What made the American POW camps effective was not that they forced Germans to abandon their beliefs, but that they made the alternative so obviously, materially, undeniably superior that ideology simply collapsed under the weight of evidence.
Some historians argue that this experience played a crucial role in post-war Germany's rapid democratization. The hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who spent time in American, British, and Canadian camps returned home with first-hand knowledge that democracy was not weak or chaotic, that former enemies could treat prisoners with humanity, that material prosperity and political freedom were not only compatible but mutually reinforcing. These men became voters, workers, fathers, teachers. They passed on their experiences to children and grandchildren. They helped create the psychological foundation for West Germany's integration into the Western Alliance and its emergence as a stable, prosperous democracy. Others argued that the impact has been overstated, that German democratization owed more to military occupation, economic aid through the Marshall Plan, and the pragmatic calculations of German elites than to the POW experience. There is truth in both perspectives, but the testimony of the prisoners themselves, preserved in thousands of letters, diaries, and oral histories, suggests that the experience was genuinely transformative for many. They had glimpsed an alternative to the ideology of blood and soil, of hierarchy and sacrifice. They had experienced a world where even prisoners had abundance, where even enemies had value, where material prosperity was not a sign of decadence but of vitality. In the final accounting, the American POW camps succeeded because they were not totalitarian. They did not try to break prisoners and remake them according to some ideological template. They simply provided the basic necessities of life: food, shelter, medical care, meaningful work, recreation, in quantities and qualities that most German soldiers had not experienced even when fighting for their own country. This contrast spoke louder than any political sermon. It demonstrated in the most intimate and personal way possible that the Nazi promise had been a lie. Germans were not strengthened by hardship and sacrifice, they were weakened by it. The American enemy was not soft and decadent, they were wealthy and confident. Democracy was not chaos, it was a system capable of organizing productive abundance.
For the young soldier from the Ardennes forest, the journey from that moment of surrender in the Belgian snow to his eventual return to Germany traced an arc of disillusionment and rebirth. He had expected death or brutality and found instead a cup of coffee and a piece of white bread. That simple reversal of expectations had opened a crack in his worldview, and through that crack, light had poured in. The light revealed all the structures he had built his life upon: the racial ideology, the mythology of German superiority, the contempt for democracy, as shadows and lies. What remained when the lies were stripped away was not despair, but possibility. The possibility that the world could be different, that nations could prosper without conquest, that humans could be valued as individuals rather than as cells in the body of the state, that freedom and abundance could coexist. Years after the war, in the quiet moments of old age, German veterans often returned to this paradox. They had been captured, defeated, imprisoned by an enemy they had been taught to hate and despise. Yet in captivity, they had experienced a quality of life superior to what they had known in their own army, often superior to what they had known in civilian life before the war. The American camps, with all their limitations and imperfections, had been das beste Ort auf Erden, the best place on earth, not because they were paradise, but because they represented something the Third Reich could never provide: the simple, sustainable dignity of a system that valued human welfare over ideological purity. This is the story that deserves to be remembered, not as a tale of American perfection. The United States had and has profound flaws, then and now, but as a story about the power of material reality to overcome ideological fantasy, about how abundance can be a form of argument, how decency can be a weapon, how the simple act of treating enemies as human beings can achieve what force alone cannot. The German soldiers who called American camps the best place on earth were not praising their captors as much as they were acknowledging a truth they had spent years trying to deny: that the world they had fought for was built on lies, and that the world they had fought against, for all its imperfections, was built on something closer to truth. In the end, they were defeated not by better soldiers or superior tactics,
though America had both, but by white bread and coffee, by running water and medical care, by wages for work and books in libraries, by the quiet, persistent demonstration that a free society organized around individual dignity and material prosperity could defeat a totalitarian state organized around sacrifice and hierarchy. The ideology that promised Germans greatness through suffering was refuted by the lived experience of prisoners who discovered that their enemies, the supposedly weak and decadent Americans, could offer even their prisoners more abundance, more security, and more dignity than the 1,000-year Reich had ever provided its own soldiers. This is the truth that German POWs carried home from America. It is a truth that helped reshape post-war Europe, and it is a truth that echoes still, that systems which respect human dignity and enable human flourishing will, in the long run, prove stronger than systems built on dreams of domination and sacrifice. The camps were not paradise, but to men who had lived in hell, who had been fed on lies and starved on ideology, they were the best place on earth, not in spite of being American, but precisely because they were.